What's up, everybody? Welcome back to the Men of the Kingdom podcast. My name is Kyle. This is my faithful co-host, Aaron. If you're new to the channel, we just want to say welcome. If you haven't, make sure you like and subscribe. But the purpose of all of this is very simple. We want to help men live successful lives according to God's design. If you're one of our faithful viewers, we want to say welcome back. You're probably thinking that we shut it down. We called it quits after, 27 episodes? But we did not. We actually had quite a few things change, which we'll fill you in before we jump into the episode here. But Aaron, I think probably biggest life change is you, between the two of us. Why don't you tell the people what's been going on and why we haven't been on in a little bit?
Hey, you can't get rid of us that easy, Kyle. I know they were thinking, hey, these guys...
Oh, finally. Get out of here.
They gave up. They hung it up. 27 videos. They lasted longer than we thought. But, hey, we're back. We're alive and well. But, yeah, man, really exciting season of life. I know we had the episode with my fiance at that time, Sammy. And now, if she was on the podcast here, she would be my wife, Sammy.
Oh, can we see the ring? Can you show them the ring?
Yeah, we can see if we can get a little bit of the bling on the camera.
Look at that.
Nice rose gold. Yeah, man, so it's been really cool. Just, getting used to married life. We're in a new house here. That's actually where we're recording.
Yeah.
So it's been fun, the life of the podcast. If you're somebody who's watched all 27 of our episodes, you'll notice we had 3 different locations. So you'll see the first one, kind of a library room. The last one we were in, Kyle and I both living together, and now this is Sammy and I's place. So it's been cool. I think everyone had a lot of fun at the wedding. Yeah. It was a good time. So excited to get back in the podcast mode. But what's new in the life of Kyle since our last episode?
Yeah. Breaking news. I'm married too.
That'd be crazy. That would be breaking news for me too.
Yeah, it would be breaking news. No, nothing that crazy. I mean, life's been good. We talked before here. I've just kind of been reflecting on your guys' thing, just so involved with the wedding and just how great that was. Not to flip it back on you, but I wanted to ask, since you are a married man now, give the people some wisdom or at least some insight. So you've been married, 3 weeks?
Yeah, it's been 32 days. So I at this point, I think I have pretty much everything figured out. So anything you need to know, I should be able to give the viewers any wisdom. Pretty much
an extra. But no, I was just going to say maybe biggest surprise or thing you've learned in the first month of being married. Is there anything that comes to mind?
So, I would just say some free game for you guys watching. So Sammy and I, we did not live together before we got married. Obviously a complicated situation. And I think a lot of people decide to live together because it's easier, right? You're only in one house, only paying one rent. For us, those pros didn't outweigh the cons of, we're thinking, wow, if we're under one roof, really what's going to change when we get married, right? It's like we're going to do, getting ready for our house, all this stuff that you do when you get married. If you do that beforehand, then after you get married, it's like, okay, now we're doing the same thing. We just have these rings and just had a big party. So I think that's what I would say to anyone watching this, especially if you're the guy in the relationship. I would encourage you to lead towards that direction. By no means easy, but I think just like most of the things in life, whether it's working out or working at your career or saving money, whatever it is, all the best things in life are, hard and take some work. And I think that us not living together, it's definitely made these first 30 days, we're still getting furniture set up throughout our house. There's different things that we don't quite have exactly how we want yet. But it's awesome. Like our life completely changed overnight. And I think that's kind of what God intended for marriage, is it to be this big commitment. He talks about, us being his brides, this whole weird symbolism. So it's obviously important to God, and I'm proud that we did things that way, even though it's made the first month kind of chaotic and hectic. It's been fun, and I would encourage, if you're watching this, maybe this is your sign to not move in together, or just wait until you guys do tie the knot to officially live under one roof.
Absolutely. I think a lot of times you talk to, or I've talked to couples who've gotten married or just younger people. One thing they're surprised by is you have these two separate lives, and then you come together, and a lot of times you're learning how to live with each other, and that can create some conflict. Yeah. And
that's so good. I was wondering which one of us was going to go there.
Not that they have. I know Aaron and Sammy very well. I don't know what happens between.
No, that's the thing. This is all just subjective. Not an expert in conflict. Right. We have a conflict-free marriage, so this is just subjective. This topic.
That's right. But we did want to. Aaron texted me when we come up. We've mentioned this on previous episodes. He's like, what do we think in this season of life makes sense to talk about? And he actually recommended overcoming conflicts. I don't know if that is any insight to what's been going on here. I'll assume not. But it's such an important topic, and one that we kind of agreed that doesn't get talked around a lot. Maybe not so much, conflict, but how to actually overcome it, especially from the biblical standpoint. What does the Bible actually say about conflict, overcoming it. So we hope in this episode here, there's some insights you can gain from the research we've done from a biblical context and life experience of ways we've messed up when it comes to resolving conflicts, ways we've succeeded, so to speak. So that really this time that we have with you guys here today is really just going to focus around conflict. And I would challenge you as we go through this, think hard when we go through are there people in your life right now that you do have this resentment for, something you're holding on to? We hope by the end of it you're inspired to make good with those people and use some of the insights you're drawing from our wisdom here, or the wisdom that we've gained from other people in the Bible, to just resolve that. So without further ado, we just want to jump into it. Aaron, I don't know if you want to kick us off here, but let's talk about conflict, and more importantly, what does the Bible say?
Yeah.
How do we overcome it?
I love it. So I do want to start with a book that gave me a little bit of inspiration around this topic. So I actually came across this when I was listening to an audiobook by a guy named Tony Evans. We've talked about him on the show before. Great author. He has a book called Kingdom Marriage, and it's all about how to live a biblical marriage, what the Bible says about marriage, this and that. He has a chapter in there about conflict resolution, and he says the best book I've ever read on the topic is a book called Peacemaker. So if you're watching this book, The Peacemaker, it's by a guy named Ken Sand. I have not read the whole thing, but from what I have read, it's really solid. And yeah, I just agree. I think especially at our age, we're at the age where, guys are starting to get in more serious relationships. They're growing into leadership positions at work or whatever it is, just graduating college. Like you're looking at living with new roommates, whatever it is. I think that we're in a season of life, and guys between, say, 20 and 30, or even maybe a little older, 35, it's like we're just in an age where you're going to naturally have conflict. And I think that there's two paths you can go with that. You can handle it as the world does, or you can handle it as the Bible does, recommends. And I think that's kind of what my thought is with this episode, is we want to be really clear about what the differences are, and why we would recommend so heavily to do what the Bible says and how that might benefit you. So I have a verse that I think I can kick us off with that just shows what God's heart is around conflict. It's from the book of Romans. We've referenced that a number of times on the show as well. Chapter 12, verse 18, it says, "Do all that you can to live in peace with everyone." And what I love about that verse is that there's no ifs, ands, or buts. There's no do all that you can to live in peace with everyone except people who take advantage of you financially, except when someone disrespects you, except XYZ, because I think that's really how the world talks about conflict is live in peace when you can, but if someone does you dirty, do them even dirtier. So just kind of setting the groundwork for why I think this episode's important. But I guess I would kick it to you with a question. When you think of conflict, and I love your calling too, of think of somebody who maybe you have conflict with in your life. Shoot, that could be big. I mean, I've heard many stories, even in my own family members not talking, right, for years. And, we did the episode on grief, and we talked about some tough stories with us. It's like, man, just thinking of people who have relatives who pass away that they had conflict with. It's like, that's tough. That's hard to sleep with. You don't want to be at a place like that. So I just think this episode's super important. I'm really excited to get into it. Where would you start with conflict in terms of how do you identify conflict? What does it even mean to you? What does your research tell you that the Bible says about it? Kind of get us going with the baseline. Maybe someone's watching this, they're like, what do they mean by conflict? Like, what types of things are they talking about? Do they mean like guys trying to fight me at the bar? Is this like strictly a family thing, a work thing? Like, where do you think kind of step one is for this whole conflict topic?
I think to back up one thing I'm trying to get better at, whether it's in work, whether it's a podcast, whether it's a relationship, I always try to understand the why behind something. Yeah. And I try to communicate that effectively. Sometimes I do a good job, sometimes I don't. Because I think when people understand the why behind something, it's a lot easier for someone to take action. Sure. So I want to just take a step back and say, what is God's view on conflict? What's his nature towards conflict? But on the flip side, why? What's the purpose of resolving conflict? Because why would we, as humans, if there's no God stuff, who cares if people are in conflict? Yeah, right. So when I was kind of reading it through some of the passages in the Bible, just trying to understand, okay, what's the why behind it? And there was a verse that came up. But the first point I made, and then I'll get into the verse, is this is really a call and a straightforward, not confrontation, but to believers especially, is to realize that God does not want people to be in conflict. So the first thing you have to do when you think about conflict is just understand God doesn't want you there, and there are times where there is things that go wrong, and we'll touch on that a little bit. But I think with anything, it starts with a desire to want to resolve the conflict.
Sure.
So before we even get into like the how to go about it,
Yeah, kind of the practical steps.
just understand that God does not want that. And here's the reason why, or at least one of them. So in Hebrews 12:14 through 15, it says, strive for peace with everyone. Peace being the opposite of conflict. And for the holiness without which no one will see the Lord. See to it that no one fails to obtain the grace of God, that no root of bitterness springs up and causes trouble, and by it many become defiled. But if you go to the beginning, it says, strive for peace with everyone, and for the holiness without which no one will see the Lord. What they're saying is, say Aaron and I, really good friends, if we were just having conflict, holding on to this bitterness, all that, it would prevent people from seeing the Lord. And basically that's what it is. So when you have this group of believers, especially conflict, you think of like a church context, fighting, there's bitterness, bickering back and forth. Unbeliever comes in there. What do they think when they don't see that unity? It's like they don't see the Lord there.
This is just like the rest of the world. This is no different.
Exactly. And so I think understanding from the biblical standpoint as a believer, like if you want to have a witness for Christ, it's really hard or pretty much impossible, according to this, to do so when you are holding on the conflict and especially not forgiving other people. So we'll get into the practical steps here, but I just want to challenge you if you've never thought about that. Hey, God, like in Matthew 5:9, it says, blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. We are to be reflections of God, and he is reflects peace. You think of like the fruits of the Spirit too. We always talk about too is love, joy, peace, which is opposite of conflict. So I just wanted to, I think that's important to understand. Set kind of the framework for why it's important.
Yeah, exactly. Zooming out, like why does this matter? You know what? Because what we're talking about, it's like it's going to be uncomfortable stuff, right? You go up to someone that you know you have conflict with, you can feel it, right? You might be their body language. It might just be that vibe in the air. We've all had those moments when you're with someone and you know there's something, whether it's under the surface, it could be a mile deep, it could be something that just happened, it could be 6 months ago, 6 years ago, but you just feel that in the air. And guys watching this, they might say, man, all these tips are great, Kyle, but I don't want to have that tough conversation. It doesn't matter. It would be easier not to. So I love that you started there, because if you understand the why of why it matters, you're willing to put yourself through that discomfort to, you know, live in peace and do all those things. But yeah, it's a great spot to start.
Yeah, and I want to expand on that too, because in our church, Salt City Church, we're going through some tough books with, was it 1st, 2nd Timothy? And they address some hard conflicts from a cultural standpoint that seem very countercultural. And one thing I've had to do is, at the end of the day, are you going to believe the Bible? One, do you believe it's God's word? And two, are you going to obey it? And so there might be things that you come across as you're reading that are maybe inside, you're like, oh, that kind of goes against what I've always believed. But at the end of the day, if this is God's word, then we have to believe it and we have to obey it, more importantly. So I think especially with this, sometimes maybe you want to hold on to a grudge, whatever, but at the end of the day, if God says to forgive because you're forgiven, which you'll touch on later, but if he wants peace, you kind of have to face that realization one point or another. It's not what Kyle's or Aaron's desires is. It's what does God say, and am I going to obey it?
Yeah, I love that.
So why don't we get into it? I'll kind of start it off with one of the points that came. It's kind of funny. We kind of compare notes at the beginning of these episodes, and he's like, oh, do you have this verse? I'm like, no. But they're very close in the same book, maybe a chapter back, chapter forward. And so the first thing I want to encourage you, let's take it now. Think of that person in your mind you have a conflict with, something that you just want to address. The first verse I came across, and one of the points I was trying to draw from it, is my first point in a practical stance is, one, address the issue directly and go to your offender. And the key word there is go. So in Matthew 18:15 through 17, I'll just do verse 15. It says, if your brother sins against you, go and tell him his fault. Between you and him alone, if he listens to you, you have gained a brother. And I think it's really important, as who is it, Brian, I think, or Brian. He recommended when we had him on the podcast, this book. What was it? Living by the Book, I think it was. And they talk about that. They like how to pick out little words, what's important. I've tried to be conscious of that. But it says, if your brother sins against you, go and tell him his fault. I just think a lot of times people get in these conflicts and they just kind of wait in the well, they did me wrong. If they want to do it, they come to me and they can solve it.
100%.
But this is very against that. It's like, hey, if someone sins against you, go to that person. Don't wait. Go tell him his fault between you and him. So I just think that's an important first thing to look at, is if there's someone wrong, don't sit there and wait for someone to come to you. Because sometimes, one, people don't know that they hurt you. Or two, they might be waiting for you to come to them. And then you're both kind of sitting in the stalemate and nothing takes place. So take the initiative, especially as the guy, but even a girl too, go to that person, and that's the first step. It starts with taking the initiative. So I don't know if there's anything you would add or some of your findings, but that stuck out to me is you got to be the one to initiate it.
So that's good. And I like too that it's just going directly to them, because what came to mind when you said that is just thinking about the world and my tendency, and I'd be curious if this rings anything for you, but just how easy it is that, say one of our mutual friends does something to you, right? Say you guys go somewhere, you buy something, they don't pay you back, right? Or they borrow something of yours, they don't give it back, whatever it may be. Why, I wonder, our tendency so often is to talk to everybody about that conflict except for the person who it involves. And I just think about that, whether it's gossiping or venting or whatever it is. So I just think that would be more my thought, and my question is, give us an example of a good way to do that and a bad way to do that. Like, what would messing that up look like, and what would doing it well look like in your opinion?
In terms of going somebody?
Yeah, in terms of going, because like it said too, go to your brother who sinned against you. So what would be if someone says, okay, I'm watching this. All right, my cousin Ray came to mind. He's been doing me bogus. He's been doing me bogus. Ray knows it. I know it. God knows it. Everybody knows it. And they say, hey, listen, Kyle just told me to go. All right, so do I give Ray straight knock on the door? Do I give him a phone call? Just talk through, what does that mean? What do you think going means? How do you do that right? How do you mess it up?
Yeah, so maybe that's something to clear up. When this passage was written versus today, I don't think go always necessarily means physical. I think it's preferred.
You don't think he was Matthew the tax collector was FaceTiming any of his homies to resolve conflict? But
I think the more important thing is to take the initiative. But if you have that ability, maybe someone is close, to go see them in person. But I think that kind of feeds into and is a good segue into my other point. One, we understand that God wants to resolve peace, but what is the goal or outcome of the conflict resolution? Are you going to this person to escalate it, kind of get things off your chest, make it yourself feel good or justified, or is it to actually find conflict? Resolution to it in peace, which is what you touched on. I think a lot of times, we've talked about this too, the motivation behind anything what you do is so important. Just like making money. Money's not a bad thing, but is your motivation to make money so you can give it away, help other people, or is it to buy a new car and look really cool, to make yourself feel good? So understand that this is a touchy subject when it comes to conflict, and maybe you have been hurt really bad. There's people who have. But when you're going to somebody to try to talk to them, understand that your end goal is to make peace and resolve this and, fix that relationship with that person. I think there is a right way to do it, which goes into Matthew 18. Here. I'm just looking at my notes here. My third point, which is address the situation in private at first and try to resolve it. I think this, and I've had this happen, and I've probably done it. A lot of times someone does somebody wrong. You go to your other friend, hey, you're not going to believe what this person did to me.
Totally,
they did this.
Talking in circles around the person.
Yeah, and then sometimes word gets back to that person, and it just makes the situation even worse. So I think that's the other point. Make sure I have my verse right here. Must have got moved on me. Sorry about that. But I'll find it here as Aaron talks too. But they talk about going first. They kind of give this breakdown of how to address conflict kind of in a church context. They say, okay, first you go to them one-on-one. And that's why I put in parentheses in my notes here is address the situation in private at first. You don't need to spread this thing to other people. Totally. You don't need to involve a bunch of people. Like, hey, if Aaron and I have an issue, I should be coming to him and we're going to address it one-on-one because we have that respect for each other and we are truly seeking resolution. We're not trying to make a bigger deal of it. So I don't know if there's anything you would add. I want to find that verse because I think I got moved down to here. So
this is skipping back a ways, but you talked about peacemaking and the title of this book, Peacemaker. So that was something I was thinking of while you're looking for that is, I'm sure if you guys are watching this and you've probably heard of this, peacekeeping. And I think there's a really big difference between peacekeeping and peacemaking. When I think of peacekeeping, I think that is a very defensive, passive strategy in terms of, say, a coworker disrespects you, or it could be anyone. It could be your wife. It could be a friend. I think peacekeeping is you feel an emotion, whether it's disrespect or whatever it may be, and you don't do anything. You could say, well, I'm doing it because I want to live in peace, right? But in reality, you're not living in peace. Right? You're feeling that and you're not doing something with it. So I think an important distinction is a peacemaker is someone who says, I'm going to create peace by living authentically, living honestly. Listen, you might talk to someone, you might say, hey, what you said to me was hurtful. I didn't appreciate it. That might not create peace in that moment, but maybe over time, the next time something comes up, they won't talk to you that way, or they won't, do whatever it was that bothered you. But if you never said anything about it, you're just sitting back, you're feeling hurt, you're feeling like something was wrong. I think that that's a really important, just small distinction of being a peacekeeper is not necessarily what we're aiming for. We're aiming to be authentic, to be real with each other, to go directly to the source, rather than, I think the flip side of that could be, one, like you said, talking to other people, or two, just talking to no one and just pushing that down. And then maybe one day you explode over something really little, and the person you're dealing with is, wow, what the heck? Why was that such a big deal? Right. And it wasn't that thing. It was the other 10 things that you just slide under the rug. So that was just something I thought of when you were explaining the difference between kind of going versus gossiping. I think there's two ditches you can get into of talking to too many people about it or talking to no one. And two, I mean, there's practical things of talking to these people, praying about it, all that. That's obviously great. If you're still feeling that emotion, even after you've done those things, then I think that's definitely a time to address it. And hopefully we'll equip guys with exactly how to do that once they get to the point where they say, hey, this is worth addressing.
For sure. I was kind of reminded too, as you talk about the peacekeeping versus peacemaking, how often do we as people, with the intention of not creating any disruptions, we see someone sinning or doing something wrong, we know they're heading towards a bad road, but we don't say anything because we want to keep the peace.
Yeah.
I was listening to a sermon today, and they were talking about that with some topics where it's like, that's not peaceful from the outside or the world's perspective. It's like, oh, let them do what they want to do. If that's what they want to do, like, you should just let them. That's what's peaceful. But it's like, man, in the long run, that's not loving to them to let them go down a road that leads to destruction. So I think we confuse peace in terms of like not addressing conflict. That's peaceful.
Yeah.
But it's unloving too when you know something's wrong. As men and people and as Christians, we are called to step up and address those things too. So I think we just use that sometimes as an excuse. Well, I don't want to rock the boat.
Yeah, 100%. A cop out. Like the short and long-term piece. And just like anything, right? You say, hey, I want comfort. Or I think of like discipline, right? Being disciplined is uncomfortable at the beginning, but then the more discipline you get, it creates comfort on the back end, right? Like that's the dichotomy of so many things, whether it's cleaning, eating healthy, just anything, saving money, right? Like it's uncomfortable when you're doing it. And then on the back end, if you have an emergency, you have money, it's comfortable. I think, peacekeeping is exactly the same way, or peacemaking. It's not going to be comfortable in the moment, but on the back end, the rewards are far outweigh the little discomfort you have in the beginning.
100%. So I did have a point here. And this kind of goes into the second point I had as a reminder. It said address the issue directly and go to your offender. And then I have a 2B, a sub point, if you will. A lot of times in conflict, we narrow and we say, okay, I see what this person did to me. I see what this person did to me. I see what this person did to me. And we never look at ourselves and say, okay, what is my responsibility in this situation?
Very true.
And so the verse that I kind of came across was James 5:16. It says, therefore confess your sins to one another and pray for one another, that you may be healed. The prayer of a righteous person has great power as it is working. So I just think oftentimes we see the shortcomings of other people. We don't look at ourselves, but this verse says, therefore confess your sins to another. So look at yourself. Take time to say, okay, maybe you have this issue with this person. What is my responsibility in that? Are there circumstances where they did everything, you have no responsibility in that? Potentially, but it's often super small. So encourage you to take a step back and look at yourself, say, okay, like what did I do that might have caused this or made it worse? And how do I, apologize for it too? So that was one sub point I wanted to make. Look at yourself too.
That's so good. That's so good. You just think of when someone hurts you too, if they're willing to admit, hey, I could have done this better. It just, your whole guard and everything just comes down, because then you realize it's not going to be a finger pointing, a blame. Yeah, that's a really, really good point. And like you said too, there are super messed up situations. I think of like abuse or domestic violence, situations like that. That's certainly not what we're talking about, right? If you're living with someone and they're at a point where they're doing things like that, you don't need to be approaching them saying, hey, I'm sorry, I'm, just existing. I think we're talking more about interpersonal conflict and work stuff, things like that. But yeah, that's an awesome point, and it's hard to do, right? It's hard to be humble enough to say the way I acted contributed to this conflict. So hard to do.
100%. Yeah, because we always want to think we're perfect, we're right. But I was reflecting on my own life. We were kind of talking about this, and I was trying to think of examples. And I think, usually the people closest to you are the ones that kind of hurt you the most.
Oh, yeah,
That's
no
just
doubt.
how it goes. If it's like some Joe Schmo off the street you don't know.
Yeah, you don't
like,
care about their opinion, how they feel.
And I was just thinking through like situations in my life that I could have handled things better or what was. And the only time I can remember, like, I've had a very good relationship with my parents. There was one time my dad and I got into it. I can't remember exactly what it was over. It was probably something stupid. But I was like going through these notes, looking through them, like, man, if I would have just like done a few of these things.
Yeah.
And we had a great relationship, but it's like, man, that took a toll on both of us. I think we probably said things we didn't mean and shouldn't have said. And it's like, man, like, you're looking back, you wish you wouldn't have done those things. So hopefully, you know, if God willing, your parents are around or whatever it is, and you have those situations or you're living through it, you're not talking. And you don't ever want to get to the end of your days or the end of their days, especially, and wish like you guys had, you know, mended that. So I just encourage you, don't wait. If you do have the opportunity to make good with somebody, although it can be hard and uncomfortable in the moment, like it's always worth it. And so I would encourage you there. So I just have, you know, one main point here to close my notes out, and I'll kick it back to you for some of your closing thoughts. But I kind of touched on it earlier, and this is the fourth point, is be willing to forgive and actually seek peace. Know what your outcome is and focus on that. God commands us to forgive others just as we have been forgiven. I think you have a verse in your notes too.
Yep.
I just think a lot of times we go into conversations, anything, and we don't really know what the end goal is or what we actually want out of it.
Right.
So really, if you are going to address something, like, understand at the end of the day, I want peace. I want to resolve this conflict. And the verse that a couple of them came up, Ephesians 4:32 says, "Be kind to one another, tenderhearted, forgiving one another, as God in Christ forgave you." Man, like we talked about this other verses of how we want to love people. We have to be filled up with love. We have to feel love from God.
Yep.
It's the same thing. Like if you don't feel that overwhelming sense of hope and joy and love, knowing you are forgiven eternally, it's really hard to forgive people in the short term.
Yep.
It's like somebody did you wrong on something stupid. It's like, man, when you think of like how much we deserve death and how undeserving we are of, you know, God's grace, it's like, who am I not to forgive this person over this silly little thing? So that's where I encourage you, is to reflect on these things. But say you do have a challenging conversation coming up, just take a step back for a second if you have that time and just reflect on God's goodness in your own life, how undeserving we are of forgiveness to a perfect God, but yet we get it. I think that'll soften your heart and make it a lot easier to say, hey, I know this person did me wrong, but like in the grand scheme of life and eternity, I want them to have everlasting life and I want them to have goodness. And so let's get over these small squabbles. So I don't know if there's anything you'd add. Is there, as you kind of think through it, like what advice would you give for somebody who maybe does have a difficult conversation that needs to be addressed? I don't know if you want to kind of like recap these things or even speak to your own personal experiences. Is there any advice you'd give on things you've done that worked well?
So I have a few things that I will share, but what you just reminded me of is, and you might have had this in your notes, Matthew 18, it's the parable of the unforgiving debtor.
Oh, yeah.
So the parable where, it's a really good one, where essentially the story is Jesus is saying, this guy, Peter, he asks, he's like, Lord, how many times should I forgive somebody? He's like 3 times, 4 times, and he gets all the way up to, he's like 7 times? Like, I really should forgive somebody 7 times? And Jesus says, no, not 7 times, but 70 times 7. So if you're a math major, you're watching this, you're like, okay, 490 times. The 491st time, I don't have to forgive him. That's not what he's saying. He's saying that his concept of how much we should forgive is exponentially greater than what ours is. So he's thinking 7, he's thinking 500. But the example he gives is, he said, when you don't forgive someone, so say someone, in your example, someone disrespects you or they do something mean to you, and you hold that grudge, he said it's like the king, who there was a prisoner who owed millions and millions of dollars in bad taxes, all these debts. And the king said, you know what? I forgive you of all your debts. And the next day, that person who was released for millions of dollars of debt went and found somebody who owed them $500 and said, I need you to pay me right now. Yeah. It's like, why, after he was just forgiven for $1 million, now he's out collecting his small debt that he owes. And that's the way we are. We're forgiven so much, but then we don't want to forgive anybody for anything on the back end. So, really what my mind kind of comes to with this whole thing is, I think especially the last few years, we've seen an example, and not a pretty example, of how the world handles conflict. And I just had some notes of when I look at worldly conflict and you can see this on social media, you can see it in your own life, you can see it at family reunions, based on, what bumper sticker somebody shows up to a family gathering with, that's going to determine who talks to who, based on different things. Hey, have you been vaccinated? Okay, you can either come to my house for Christmas or you cannot come to my house. Right. And, not going to say, I don't care what your stance is on any of these things. You could, on the flip side, it's, oh, you didn't vote for this person or you don't like this politician. Listen, I don't care what it is. I think our church did a great sermon on that. I could even drop it in the notes of how both sides of the political spectrum are messed up and don't go towards God's design. But these are some things that I think would describe the world's advice for how to handle conflict. Argue, yell, get overly emotional, protest, divide people. Basically saying, if you're in conflict with someone, your goal should be to just dig your roots down on what your position is so that the other person will be enlightened by your strong position and come to see your side. And I think the Bible would tell us that as believers, we're not called to live that way at all. So in hindsight, or on the flip side, how should Christians handle conflict? Truthfully, meaning have difficult conversations, having difficult conversations with, like you started with the goal of peace, right? When people are yelling and commenting mean things on social media and, lighting buildings on fire, or politicians making crude jokes, calling other people names, none of those things are peacemaking. Those things are intentionally dividing. They're hurtful. They're demeaning. So that's totally opposite. And like you said, going to the source. Listen, Facebook is not the source. Commenting on someone's post, that does not count as going to the source. I love what you said too of, this is probably one of the best pieces of advice I've ever gotten. It was from a college professor, and I had an issue in his class, and I was emailing him. He wasn't getting back to me. Finally, I went to his office, and he's like, I intentionally wasn't getting back to you because I wanted to teach you the lesson that when you have something going on, you should always seek the most in-person method of communication possible. He's like, if you're a student on the other side of the country, that might be a call, but guess what? A call is more personal than an email. If you can't call somebody, maybe it's a text message, or maybe it's a voice memo on your iPhone. There's always ways to be more personal in your communication. And typically, I found in my life that when we're in person, you can see those differences a lot clearer. And I think it's really easy, keyboard warriors, right? Or people who are really tough over email. Man, and Brian talked about this too, Brian McKenzie on that episode. It's really hard to hate people and to be mean up close and personal. Yeah. So people will say things, they'll act in a way they would never act if you're in the same room over the internet. So if you're watching this, we would just encourage you, that's what go means. Go to the person, be in person, maybe call them, maybe text them, whatever the most in-person method of communication is, leverage that. A few things here too is the tilt towards forgiveness. I had a verse here, Ephesians 4:32, be kind and compassionate, forgive one another, just as Christ, God, forgave you. I think that's pretty straightforward. We're never going to be able to forgive people more on this earth than we've been forgiven. So just always have that mindset. And then I think the direct straightforwardness, and this is one that, man, I really work on, is just thinking through, even when you're in conflict or when you're talking to someone, say, you could talk to me and say, hey, I'm having a conflict with a coworker. I want to talk through some strategy before I go into that conversation. I don't think that's a bad thing. It's not talking behind someone's back. It's, I'm going to prepare so when I go into that, I'm level-headed. I know what I'm going to say. I'm respectful. I can deliver it in a way where they'll receive it. Like you said, I can admit my fault. I can admit my responsibility in the situation. But that verse, it says, don't speak evil against one another, dear brothers and sisters. If you criticize and judge each other, you are criticizing and judging God's law. Your job is to obey the law, not judge whether it applies to you. So like you said, our job isn't to decide, do I understand this verse about saying I live in peace? That's not our job. Our job is to obey the law. So I think those are just a few things, kind of wrapping it all up. So identify what the conflict is. I would say figure out your barometer of, is this something serious enough that I need to address? Or maybe it is something you can let go, right? Somebody cutting you off in traffic, someone not paying you back for their half of a meal. Listen, those are little things. You have to pick your battles. That's one thing too. You asked what I've learned in 30 some days of marriage. I'm already learning that. If I try to pick every little thing that happens that bothers me with somebody I'm around every hour of the day, I'm not going to be a fun person to live with. Right. Listen, if, my wife shuts the dishwasher when maybe I'd open it, or she opens a window when I'd close it, there's some things that you just have to let go. Now, there's other things that you definitely don't want to let go. And I think identifying that too. So those are some things that come to mind for me. Identifying conflict, like you said, going right to the source, having that mindset of peace, being prepared. You asked, I think that was the original question, what tip would I give? I've always found that the more prepared you are for those conversations, you might not stick to your script, you might not stick to your notes, but I think you can find yourself in an emotional situation very quick if you go into a difficult conversation with no preparation. Yeah. So I think that's something too that you and I talk about that a lot, whether it's, work conversations or meetings or presentations. You should just always be prepared if you're having a conversation that matters.
Absolutely. Dang, that was a good summary. That was good. Yeah. So I have nothing to add. I think you hit it on the head. I encourage you to do a simple Google search. That's what we do a lot of times when we're prepping. Mm-hmm. Just do, what does the Bible say about, and then fill in the blank. Mm-hmm. And there's forget that site itself, it'll come up. But just read through some of the verses. Do your research for your own and say, okay, what does the Bible actually say about coming over conflict, hard times with other people, hard conversations? There's a lot of information, a lot of knowledge in there. Mm-hmm. So if you do have a tough conversation that you feel in your heart that you need to address after listening to this, do what Aaron said, all those things he outlined. Maybe seek wise counsel, people you trust who are not gossiping and just getting it off your chest because you need to vent, but more like, hey, XYZ, how do I approach this in a loving way?
That's a really good tip we didn't even talk about too, though. What? Is just finding people that have been through it, right? Yeah. If you're watching this and you're 16 years old, you might think you know how to deal with conflict. You don't. Yeah. We don't. I'm getting closer to 30 than 20. I know, man, it's crazy. And I just think of like how much I thought I knew at 20, 22, 18, 16. But those guys who are in your life that have walked through all those seasons, they've probably been through a lot of what that's a really great point we didn't even talk about. But I love that. I love that advice of seek someone who you trust, that you can bring situations to, you can confide in them, they're not going to share it, and just pick their brain. That's really great advice.
100%. Well, cool. That's all I have. We really hope that there was something you gleaned out of here that you can use in your next conversation with somebody. And maybe you're at a good point where you're like, hey, I don't really feel like I have anybody that I have anything with. Great. You probably will sometime in your life. Conflict in the broken world and sinful world is bound to happen. But thank God we certainly got a peace and we can overcome that. So
that's the last thing I'll say. And I know you're trying to close us out here. I keep stopping you. I think this is really quick, but a big difference between how the world views conflict and how we do. And you see this again, social media is proof of this. Everyone is so shocked when there's any sort of conflict. I think as believers, we shouldn't be shocked. No. We're told that we live in a broken world, that we're all broken people. And if you believe that, then conflict would not be shocking. It would just be what you expect to be the norm. Yeah. So I think that's something worth putting in. Like you said, if you don't have conflict right now, you will. And when you do, don't be shocked. Yeah. Just realize it's a normal part of life. And, as believers, I think that's a way we can be different is when conflict arises, we stay cool because we expect it. Right. We plan for it. The Bible tells us it's coming, and we're supposed to be equipped to handle it when it does.
100%. Good stuff. And it's openbible.info. You can go
that's
on
the
there.
Site.
Yeah, and type in anything, any topic you can think of. They'll have verses. So we hope that you found this episode helpful. We wish you best of luck, and hopefully be praying for anybody who has tough conversations coming up. But yeah, seek wise counsel from people, do research in the Word, and ultimately pray to God. He'll give you the wisdom to say what needs to be said in your next conversation. So we appreciate you tuning into this episode. It was a fun one. Best of luck with everything. We're happy to be back. Congratulations, Aaron, on his marriage. And until next time,
keep advancing the kingdom.